In the 19th century, forward the middle or the end of the 19th century, said the white-haired man, society tended to filter that through the fabric of words. Reading new stories from back then, you might get the idea that there was hardly any crime, or that a single murder could throw a whole country into tumult. We didn't want that in the home or in our dreams and fantasies, and yet it was a fact that terrible crimes were committed, mutilations and all kinds of rape, even serial killing. Of course, most of the serial killers were never caught. Take the most famous case of the day. No one knew who Jack the Ripper was. Everything was passed through the filter of words, everything trimmed to fit our fear. What does a child do when he's afraid? He closes his eyes. What does a child when he is about to be raped and murdered? He closes his eyes. And he screams too, but first he closes his eyes. Words served that purpose. And the funny thing is, the archetypes of human madness and cruelty weren't invented by the men of our day, but by our forebears. The Greeks, you may say, invented the evil. The Greeks saw the evil inside us all, but testimonies of proofs of this evil no longer move us. They strike us as futile, senseless. You could say the same about madness. It was the Greeks who showed us the range of possibilities, and yet now they mean nothing to us. Everything changes, you say. Of course, everything changes, but not the archetypes of crime, not any more than human nature changes. Maybe it's because polite society was so small back then. I'm talking about the 19th century, 18th century, 17th century. No doubt about it. Society was small. Most human beings existed on the outer fringes of society. In the 7th century, for example, at least 20% of the merchandise on every slave ship died. By that I mean the dark-skinned people who were being transported for sale to Virginia, say, and that didn't get anyone upset or make headlines in the Virginia papers or make anyone go out and call for the ship captain to be hanged. But if a plantation owner went crazy and killed his neighbor and went galloping back home, dismounted and promptly killed his wife, 2 deaths in total, Virginia society spent the next 6 months in fear, and the legend of the murdered or on horseback might be linger for generations. Or look back at the French during the Paris Commune in 1871. Thousands of people were killed and no one batted an eye. Around the same time, a knife sharpener killed his wife and his elderly mother, and then he was shot and killed by the police. The story didn't just make all the French newspaper. It was written up in papers across Europe and even got a mention in the New York Examiner. How come? The ones killed in the commune weren't part of society. The dark-skinned people who died on the ship weren't part of society. Whereas the woman killed in a French provincial capital and the murdered on horseback in Virginia were. What happened to them could be written. What happened to them could be written, you might say. It was legible. That's a words back Words back then were mostly used in the art of avoidance or not of revelation. Maybe they revealed something all the same. I couldn't tell you. The young man covered his face with his hands. This isn't your first trip to Mexico, he said, uncovering his face and smiling a cat-like smile. No, said the white-haired man. I was there for a while a few years ago and tried to help, but the situation was impossible. And why did you come back this time? To have a look, I guess, said the white-haired man. I was staying at a friend's house, a friend I made last time. Mexicans are the hospitable people. Are a hospitable people. It was an unofficial trip. Oh no, said the white-haired man. And what's your unofficial opinion about what's going on there? I have several opinions, Edward. I'd prefer that none of them be published without my consent. The young man covered his face with his hands and said, Professor Kessler, my lips are sealed. All right then, said the white-haired man. I'll tell you 3 things I'm sure of. A. Everyone living in that city is outside of society, and everyone, I mean everyone, is like the ancient Christians in the Roman circus. B. The crimes have different signatures. C. The city seems to be booming. It seems to be moving ahead in some ineffable way, but the best thing will be for every last one of the people there to head out into the desert some night and cross the border. When the sun began to set in the blaze of red, and the twins, the Indians, and the man at the next table had been gone for a long time, Fate decided to ask for the check. A shubidar-skinned girl who wasn't the waitress he had before browed and asked whether everything had been to his liking. Everything, said Fed, as he fell in his pocket for money. Then he went back to watching the sunset. He thought about his mother, about his mother's neighbor, about the magazine, about the streets of New York, all with an unspeakable sadness and weariness. He opened the book by the former Sandhurst professor and read a paragraph at random. Many captains of slave ships looked on their task as a rule complete when they had delivered their slaves to the West Indies, but it was often impossible to realize the proceeds of the sale of slaves fast enough to provide the ship concerned with a return cargo of sugar. Merchants and captains could not be certain of the prices which they will receive at home for goods taken on their own account. Planters might take several years to pay for the slaves. Sometimes the European merchant preferred to have remittances from the West Indies in bills of exchange than to have sugar, indigo, cotton, or ginger in exchange for the slaves, because the prices of these goods in London were unpredictable or low. What pretty names, he thought. Indigo, sugar, ginger, cotton, the reddish flowers of the indigo bush, the dark blue paste with copper glints, a woman painted indigo, washing herself in the shower. When he grew up, the chubby waitress came over and asked him where he was headed. To Mexico, said Faith. I guessed that, said the waitress, but where in Mexico? Leaning on the counter, a cook smoked a cigarette and watched them, waiting for his answer. To Santa Teresa, said Faith. It isn't a very nice place, said the waitress, but it's big and there are a lot of clubs and places to have fun. Faith looked at the ground, smiling, and realized that the desert sunset had tinted the tiles of a soft red. I'm a reporter, he said. You're going to write about the crimes, said the cook. I don't know what you are talking about. I'm going to cover the boxing match this Saturday, said Faith. Who's fighting? asked the cook. Count Pickett, the New York light heavyweight. I'm used to follow the fights, said the cook. I bet didn't check out the boxing digest, but one day I made up my mind to give it up. Now I don't know the names. Do you want that drink? It's on the house. Faith sat at the corner and asked for a glass of water. The cook smiled and said he knew for a fact all reporters drank. I do too, said Faith, but I think there's something wrong with my stomach. After bringing him a glass of water, the cook wanted to know who was up against Count Pickett. I don't remember the name, said Faith. I have it written down somewhere. A Mexican, I think. Strange, said the cook. There's never any good Mexican light heavyweights. Once every 20 years, you get a heavyweight who usually winds up crazy and shot dead, but never a light heavyweight. I could be wrong. Maybe it's not a Mexican, admitted Faith. Maybe he's Cuban or Colombian, said the cook. Although the Colombians do not have a tradition on light heavyweights either. Faith drank the water and got up and stretched. It's time for me to go, he said. Though in fact he was happy at the restaurant. How far it is to Santa Teresa, he asked. That depends, said the cook. Sometimes there are a lot of trucks at the border and you can spend half an hour waiting. Say 3 hours from here to Santa Teresa and then half an hour or 45 minutes at the border. 4 hours altogether. From here to Santa Teresa it's only an hour and a half, said the waitress. The cook looked at her and said that depended on the car and how well the driver knew the terrain. Have you ever driven in the desert? No, said Faith. Well, it isn't easy. It looks like the simplest thing in the world, but there's nothing simple about it, said the cook. You're right about that, said the waitress, especially at night. Driving at night in the desert scares me. Make a mistake, take a wrong turn, and you're liable to go 30 miles in the wrong direction, said the cook. Maybe I should go now while it's still light out, said Faith. It won't do you much good, said the cook. It will be dark in 5 minutes. Sunsets in the desert seems like they will never end until suddenly, before you know it, they're done. It's like someone just turned out the lights, said the cook. Faith asked for another glass of water and went to drink it by the window. Don't you want something else to eat before you go? He heard the cook say. He didn't answer. The desert began to disappear. He drove for 2 hours along dark roads with the radio on, listening to a Phoenix jazz station. He passes places where there were houses and restaurants and yards with white flowers and crookedly parked cars, but then on the were no lights on in the houses, as if the inhabitants had died that very night, and the breath of blood still lingered in the air. He made out the shapes of hill silhouettes against the moon and the shapes of low clouds sitting motionless or speeding west at a given moment, as if driven by a sudden fitful wind, fitful wine that lifted dust clouds adorned in fabulous human garb by the car's headlights, or the shadows created by the headlights, as if the dust clouds were tramps or ghosts looming up alongside the road. He got lost twice. Once he was tempted to turn back toward the restaurant or Tucson. The other time he came to a town called Patagonia, where a boy at the gas station told him the easiest way to Santa Teresa. On his way out of Patagonia, he saw a horse. When the headlines swept over it, the horse lifted its head and looked at him. Face stopped the car and waited. The horse was black, and after a moment it moved and vanished into the dark. He passed a mesa, or what he took to be a mesa. It was huge, completely flat on top, and from one end of the base to the other, it must have been at least 3 miles long. There was a gully next to the road. He got out of the car, leaving the lights on, and urinated at length, breathing the cool night air. Then the road sloped down into a kind of valley that at first glimpse struck him as gigantic. In the farthest corner of the valley, he thought he saw a glow, but it could have been anything. A convoy of trucks moving very slowly, the first lights of a town, or maybe just his desire to escape the darkness, which in some way reminded him of his childhood and adolescence. At some point in between childhood and adolescence, he thought he had dreamed of this landscape or one like it, less dark, less desert-like. He was in a bus with his mother and one of his mother's sisters, and they were taking a short trip from New York to a town near New York. He was next to the window, and the view never changed, just buildings and highways, until suddenly they were in the country. At that exact moment, or maybe earlier, the sun had begun to set, and he watched the trees. A small wood. True thought in his eyes it looked bigger, and then he thought he saw a man walking along the edge of the little wood, in great strides, as if he didn't want one night to overtake him. He wondered who the man was. The only way he could tell it was a man and not a shadow was because they wore a shirt and swung his arms as he walked. The man's loneliness was so great, Faye remembered, that he wanted to look away and cling to his mother. But instead he kept his eyes open until the bus was out of the woods, and buildings, factories, and warehouse once again leaned the sides of the road. The valley he was crossing was was lonelier now and darker. He was himself striding along the roadside. He shivered. Then he remembered the unholding his mother's ashes and the neighbor's cup that he hasn't returned. The coffee infinitely cold now, and his mother's videotapes that no one will ever watch again. He thought about stopping the car and waiting until the sun came up. He knew without being told that for a black man to sleep in a rental car parked on the shoulder wasn't the best idea in Arizona. He changed stations. A voice in Spanish began to tell the story of a singer from Gomez Palacio who had returned to his city in the state of Durango just to commit suicide. Then he heard a woman's voice singing rancheras. For a while, as he drove through the valley, he listened. Then he tried to go back to the gas station in Phoenix and couldn't find it. On the American side of the border stood a town called Adobe. It had once been an adobe factory, but now it was a collection of houses and appliance stores, almost all strung along a long Main Street. At the end of the street, you came out into a brightly lit empty lot, and immediately after that was the American border post. The customs officer asked for his passport, and Faith handed it to him. With the passport has his press ID. The customs officer asked if he was coming to write about the killings. No, said Faith. I'm going to cover the fight on Saturday. What fight? Asked the customs officer. Count Pickett, the light heavyweight from New York. Never heard of him, said the officer. He's going to be the world champ, said Faith. I hope you're right, said the officer. Then Faith advanced 300 feet to the Mexican border, and he had to get out of the car and open his suitcase. Then show his car papers, his passport, and his press ID. He was asked to fill out some forms. The faces of the Mexican policemen were numb with exhaustion. From the window of the custom house, he saw the long high fence that divided the two countries. 4 birds were perched on the farthest stretch of the fence, their heads buried in their feathers. It's cold, said Faith. Very cold, said the Mexican official who has studied the form Faith had just filled out. The birds, they're cold. The official looked in the direction Faith was pointing. They are turkey buzzards. They are always cold in this time of night, he said. Faith got a room at a motel called Las Brisas in the northern parts of Santa Teresa. Every so often, trucks passed along the highway, headed to Arizona. Sometimes they stopped on the other side of the highway, next to the gas pumps, and then they set off again to their drivers, or their drivers go out and had something to eat at the service station, which was painted sky blue. In the morning, there were hardly any big trucks, just cars and pickups. Faith was so tired that he didn't even notice what time it was when he fell asleep. When he woke up, he went out to talk to the motel clerk and asked him for a map of the city. The clerk was a guy in his mid-20s, and he told Faith that they had never had a map at Las Brisas, at least not since he'd been working there. He asked where Faith wanted to go. Faith said he was a reporter and he was there to cover the Count Pickett fight. Count Pickett versus El Mero Lino Fernandez, said the clerk. Lino Fernandez, said Faith. He recalled him El Mero Lino, said the clerk with a smile. So who do you think will win? Pickett, said Faith. We'll see, but I bet you are wrong. Then the clerk ripped out a piece of paper and drew him a map with precise directions to the Arena del Norte boxing stadium, where the fight would be held. The map was much better than Faith expected. The Arena del Norte looked like an old theater from the 1900s, with a boxing ring set in the middle of it. At one of the officers there, Faith picked up his credentials and asked where Pickett was staying. They told him the American fighters hadn't come to town yet. Among the reporters he met were a couple of men who spoke English and who planned to interview Fernandez. Faith asked whether he could go along with them, and the reporters shrugged their shoulders and said it was fine with them. Then, when they got to the hotel where Fernandez was giving the press conference, the fighters was talking to a group of Mexican reporters. The Americans asked him in English whether he thought he could beat Pickett. Fernandez understood the questions and said yes. The Americans asked him whether he had ever seen Pickett fight. Fernandez didn't understand the question, and one of the Mexican reporters translated. The important thing is to trust your own strength, said Fernandez, and the American reporters wrote his answer in their notebooks. Do you know Pickett record? They asked him. Fernandez waited for the questions to be translated. Then he said that kind of things didn't interest him. The American reporters snickered. They asked him for his own record. 35, said Fernandez. 25 wins. 18 of them knockouts. 3 losses. 2 draws. Not bad, said one of the reporters, and he went on asking questions. Most of the reporters were staying at the Hotel Sonora Resort in the center of Santa Teresa. When Faith told them he was staying at a motel on the edge of town, they said he should check out and try to get a room at the Sonora Resort. Faith stopped by the hotel, where he got the same that he'd stepped into a conversation of Mexican sport writers. Most of the Mexican reporters spoke English, and they were much friendlier than the American reporters he met. Or so it seemed at first. At the bar, some were placing bets on the fights, and as a group they seemed generally cheerful and laid back. But in the end, Faith decided to stay at his motel. From a phone at the Sonora Resort, he made a cold call to the magazine and asked to speak to sport editor. The woman he talked to said no one was there. The officers are empty, she said. She had a hoarse, a nasal voice, and she didn't talk like a New York secretary, but like a country person who has just come from the cemetery. This woman has first-hand knowledge of the planet of the dead, thought Faith, and she doesn't know what she's saying anymore.